Hello again. This is number three in this series, and what I want to talk about this time is a couple of the notions about policy and politics, particularly issues of local control, local discretion, local leadership, and so forth. So we hear the term local control all the time. It's been interesting for me to work with all these states on the implementation of the Common Core. And so many of them talk about local control as being a hindrance to state leadership in the implementation of the Common Core. And while local control is a fine line to walk, there are specific ways in which to deal with local control. On the one hand, local control can be interpreted as leave us the heck alone. You can't make us do anything. To the other side of it, to say, well, if there's a certain direction we have to go, give us choices so that we can initiate changes, make decisions on our own, decide the process or the practice that we want to put in place that will get us where it's intended to go. And so let me talk a little bit of just simply about the concept of local control. Actually, local control in the beginning, had nothing to do with the relationship between local schools and the state, or local governments at the city county level in the state. It was a Jeffersonian concept back in the days when the federal union was being created, and Jefferson argued at length for the notion of local control. And what he meant by local control was state control. He basically believed that there should be a very limited federal government, and that most of the decision making and initiative and responsibility be that of the state. And so that's how it really got started. And when you think about many of the federal policies today, from No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, to the Affordable Care Act, and those kind of things, it makes you really think about uh, I wish Jefferson were still alive, and making that argument. And that seems to be one of the places or pieces of our history that we haven't thought much about. And Jefferson's idea was that the states came first. It was the states that formed the federal government, not the federal government that formed the states. And even back when everybody wasn't a state in the Union, the only way you could join the Union was for there to be a vote of the other states. And so there was quite a bit of discretion at the state level, and it was probably more important to be governor of a state, particularly if you go back to some of the history of people who were vying for the governorship in places like Texas and New York and so forth. They were far more powerful than the presidents at that time. So that was supposed to be a federal to state relationship, but it's come to be a centralized government to local, meaning a state government compared to cities, towns, schools, or the federal government compared to kind of the states. And we talked about the express powers of the federal government. I'm not going to repeat that again. Uh, but again, it's just been interesting when the East Coast states talk about local control, the West Coast states talk about local control, the Midwest states talk about local control. But let me tell you a little bit about the interpretation of that when it comes to education policy. In almost all of the East states, particularly along the coast, the state departments of education are very powerful. They decide what budget you're going to have. They decide the textbooks that you're going to use. They decide how many teachers you're going to have. They're the exclusive authority to certify those teachers in most cases. And basically, most of the decision making is at the state level, as opposed to in the Midwest, where we don't do textbook adoptions here in Nebraska. There are multiple avenues for certification of teachers, and lots of discretion at the local level, even though at the local level, including my time in Bloomfield and North Platte, when I didn't think we had as much authority as we ought to have had at that time. So the federal government gets its power from this general welfare clause because, again, it states that those things that are not expressly given to the Congress are to be the express responsibility and authority of the state level. But you use that general welfare and you can say, well, we need a better workforce, so career and tech education comes in. At one time, the federal government basically funded driver education because the statistics showed that teenagers were the ones that were having the most accidents and having the most fatalities of all the driving groups. Therefore, putting driver education into the schools was a general welfare kind of thing. Title I, as we mentioned, also was that. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Americans with Disabilities, all based on those general welfare kinds of things. And it's pretty hard to argue whether or not those are not general welfare, but once money starts to flow from the federal government, somehow the federal government thinks they need to be accountable. And so the recipients of that money then, instead of having the accountability to the state level, end up with accountability to the federal level. And I'll just use a couple of an example of how that can get so far off of what its intentions. No Child Left Behind is probably classic in this particular case, because I don't think on a nationwide basis, well, in Nebraska I know, the federal government puts in 10% or less of the total expenditure of education, and that includes the lunch program, Title I, Title IX, or special education, all those kind of things, and yet has 100% of the accountability when it comes to reporting student achievement groups. That seems to me to be really strange, and I'm not sure how that has been allowed to continue to become the practice, and as a result, the policy by default for now in excess of 10 years. So under the General Welfare Clause, that's how that kind of thing happens. But I also recall a senator from North Carolina attacking me during a National Council of State Legislators meeting in North Carolina, and I was doing my thing about No Child Left Behind and how badly that policy just simply doesn't make sense. It's not rational, doesn't in any way enable leadership. And his comment to me was, well, sir, you sound like you don't want to be accountable for anything. And I'm going to tell you that if you're going to take federal money, you are going to be accountable. And I said, well, with all due respect, sir, there is no such thing as federal money. And after he seemed to be having a slight heart attack, he said, I don't understand what you mean. I said, that money did not come from the federal government. That money came from taxpayers in my state and in your state, and I have no problem being accountable to the taxpayers in Nebraska for what we're doing in our schools, and we should get our share of that money because our taxpayers provided that share of that money. And so if you take everything in No Child Left Behind and turn it back to accountability to local taxpayers, you're not going to get any problem from me, because we'll figure out how to do this and how to do it right that fits our citizens. And just because it doesn't fit in North Carolina, it doesn't make North Carolina doing the right thing and us doing the wrong thing. And I said, and by the way, the same thing really applies to state money. The state does not have money. The state holds in trust, just as the federal government does, the money that local taxpayers, businesses, all those tax-paying individuals and groups provide, and school districts are simply getting back what their own local patrons have been putting in. And so because our Constitution says we'll be responsible as a state for the education, having some accountability to the state makes sense. I think it has to be tempered against how best to do that, and we thought we had found a way to balance that fairly well, and so forth. So anyway, I think you get the point. So on the East Coast, you see lots of mandates. People think that's still local control. On the West Coast, you see lots of mandates, and people still think that's local control. In the Midwest, and particularly Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, particularly have fewer mandates, and we still not sure we have local control that we want. But the case, in fact, is the more remote you are, whether as a state or as a community or government entity, the more remote you are from the center of the policy development process, the more local control you actually have. Delaware is a good example, a small state, 19 school districts is all there is. You can drive clear across the state in probably 2 hours and 15 minutes. They don't have the same relationship at the state level to their schools as do the other states, like the New Yorks, the Connecticuts, the Massachusetts, Floridas, Maryland, and so forth. In the case of Nebraska, when you look at who has the most local control, let's put a couple of options up and discuss them a little bit. Omaha Public Schools versus Eustis Farnham. On the one hand, because the Omaha Public Schools has 55,000 students in it, it has some discretion that that Eustis Farnham doesn't have. On the other hand, because of the distance from Eustis Farnham to Lincoln, they could be doing a lot of things out there that their community has done for years and years and been the practice, and nobody questions that until someone happens to light on it or feel that they have not been, or they've been harmed in some way. And so in that respect, they have more local control. So it's not just an issue of remoteness in many cases. The Omaha Public Schools has to do things differently because at 55,000 kids, and I don't know how many school buildings are in the Omaha schools, but they have all the way from very wealthy kids to very poor kids, all the languages that are spoken in the Omaha Public Schools, the turnover of families and the mobility of those families just simply demands that things get done differently in Omaha Public Schools than at Eustis Farnham. Millard versus Broken Bow is another classic example. Broken Bow was one of the first schools that applied to a provision we put into Rule 10 to say, look, we would like to not meet this particular piece of Rule 10 because we're going to put in a continuous improvement process, and we want our accreditation based upon our ability to demonstrate that our achievement scores go up and up and up. And they were the first community we allowed to do that. On the other hand, Millard was probably one of the school districts in the state who spent more money in developing teachers in terms of professional development, sending them off to meetings and so forth, doing all the latest and greatest kind of things. You allowed some amount of discretion there that you would not allow in some other communities. Another example would be Bellevue and Syracuse. Bellevue basically lives on the federal impact aid caused by the Stratcom installation, and that money is not counted as part of the receipts in their state aid calculation, and as a result, they've got lots and lots of money. I mean, they're not just rich, I'm not saying that, or that they waste that money, but they've got some discretionary funding that allows them to do some things that are unique to the issues of military kids. For example, the Bellevue schools have many more K through 6 kids than they do 7 through 12 kids because the vast majority of the enlisted people who are at the Stratcom base are in their first few years, first 3 to 4 years of their service, and even if they're career officers, they'll probably move at some point in time, but most of them are at the age where they have elementary age kids. High school kids coming into the system are highly mobile. They move around a lot because the transfers of either one or both parents within the military makes them unique, and you have to provide some ways in which they can make decisions that you wouldn't allow another school district to do. Syracuse, on the other hand, is a small district that's had a reputation for doing very good things for kids, finding ways to effectively utilize the resources that it has, and certainly you want to provide some measure of local discretion and initiative that will allow that kind of thing to happen. So there's a variety of reasons why those things happen, and trying to apply the 65-mile-an-hour speed limit to every single car or every single highway just makes no sense, as it does in the case of speed limits, where you can go all the way from a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit all the way up to the interstate, and I've seen people not even pay attention to the mileages that are posted. Okay, how policy comes into being is that at the local level, you typically have two dimensions of policy. One is the policy statement itself, which tends to be more of a purpose, intent, outcome kind of statement, and then there's the rules and regulations that put it in place. Many board policy manuals will have like green pages for all of the policy statements, and then either white pages or some other color for the rules and regulation side of it. What that's supposed to be is that the policy piece of it is the board's responsibility. The board adopts a policy statement. And basically when it adopts the policy statement, normally the practice is they also approve the rules and regulations, but the idea is the board has said, here's the purpose, here's the intent, here's what we want to accomplish. Now, Mr. Superintendent Administrator, you and your team, however you want to do this, tell us the rules and regulations that you would put in place so that we accomplish, in effect, what this policy is supposed to say. Now, the way that that usually happens is that both of those documents exist at the same time. In other words, the board works with the policy document, the board reviews the rules and regulations that are proposed so that when they adopt the policy and approve the rules, those things fit together like this, at least at the intent, at the start of it. And this is the way state policy works. This is the way local policy works, except state policies are not green and white or anything like that. But that's the idea behind it, because they're really two separate functions. Rule making is administrative. Policy making is board, public kind of a process, and so forth. And it's been my experience that if you, as a leader in a school district, if you promote the policy-making function of the board and make sure they feel ownership of that process, then they tend not to get involved overly so in the administrative side of it. But if you don't allow them, they'll get involved in both the policy and the administrative rules. And this is the kind of things that tends to strangle administrators. And usually superintendents that have difficulty with their boards is the unwillingness to allow the board to do its policy or encourage the board to do its policy making function, and wanting to, as the chief administrator or the administrative team, have more authority than really you're intended to have by the structure of things. Those tend to degenerate into turf battles between boards and their administrators. However, I've found again that you allow the board the ability to make the policy decision, and then you provide the rules and regulations or procedures to put that in place. Let them approve them, not adopt them, but approve them. That tends to create this working relationship, because even as a superintendent, your job is to basically help the board achieve its goals. And so you have to share those things, with the board taking the lead on the policy side, the administrators taking the lead on the rules and regulations side, but both of them coming together in that public place of debate about purpose and intent. One of the questions that comes up is like student handbooks, teacher handbooks, parent handbooks, and so forth. While I don't think it's necessary for the board to approve those, it's probably a good idea for them to at least take a look at them and enter some kind of motion in the minutes that they reviewed them or accepted them. I always had the boards approve them because they were rules and regulations. They did follow the policies. And that way, when a teacher or a student or a parent argued with some provision that was in the handbook, I could simply say, well, the board's approved this. This is the way we're going to do this. Now, if you want to come to the board meeting and basically present your case, I'd be willing to let you do that. If you want to go to some kind of a hearing process, I'll put together a team of administrators, including a board member, and we'll hear what you have to say. But until we change the handbook, nothing's going to be different about that. That seemed to always be a good thing to do. Because you don't want handbooks that are so prescriptive that you can't defend them. But having board members aware of what's in a handbook is a good thing, because they get a lot of comments from people when they see them on the streets, when they see them in the coffee shops or at the restaurants or diners or places kind of like that. I'm looking here at my notes to see if there's something else. Well, let's bring this one to a conclusion. And I think there will be one final video for you to take a look at. So we'll close this one out and get on then to the next one.